Did you recently go on the internet and see arguments about free will? Are you confused? Well, you should be. And we're going to show you exactly why you should be confused and maybe make it a little bit better. Maybe on this episode.
We hope so.
Do we, though?
I think so.
Okay, we do. We hope we make it a little bit better, at least a little, on this episode of The Provisionist Perspective. Welcome back to The Provisionist Perspective. I'm Eric.
And I'm Drew.
And we wanted to give a bit of an explainer episode about what is free will. What is libertarianism? What does it mean when we say we believe in free will or that we're libertarians? And we're going to show a little bit why these things are confusing, how the rabbit holes of this philosophical and theological argument get so crazy making.
Very, very. This has been an episode that I think has been a long time coming in many ways, because I think we have two different groups of people in our audience. Some of you are super familiar with this. You're all steeped up in it. And then others of you are like, when we talk about libertarianism, we're like, isn't that a political party? Like, what,
don't they believe like all government's evil or something? Like, yeah.
So we hope to clear this up a little bit today for you. We have a couple of clips to show you. Eric, do you want to start off with kind of giving your understanding of libertarian freedom? Also, basically, when we say libertarian free will, we mean what all normal people mean when they use the words free will.
When you say you have a choice, that's just what that normally means. That you could have refrained or not refrained from any given, and we use these terms, moral action, right? Because what we don't really, if you want to consider what cereal you had this morning, whether you had Lucky Charms or Cheerios, that's not really a moral choice. We don't really, that's interesting, I guess, but what we're really concerned about is when you make moral choices. And as Christians, we're concerned about when we sin, when we don't sin, when we do good things, when we don't do good things. So we talk about moral action. So we'll say when you are the ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action, or contra-causal free will. You may hear that's another term I'm throwing at you. Contra-causal free will, where you have contra-choice, where you could have done one thing or you could have done another thing. Another way that I think term that clears this up a little bit. I hope you have your notepad out. Another term that clears this up a little bit is like agent causal libertarianism. Agent causal, which means the agent is the one that is the prime mover, the first mover of their choice. So if someone asks you, where did your choice come from? That question assumes that it's somewhere outside of the agent, somewhere outside of yourself, which we just think is the normal way of thinking of choice. I decided to do that, is just really how we mean it.
Yep. That's good. And also known as like agent causal freedom, or you could almost say self-determinism. I wonder if that phrase is triggering for some people.
It might be.
But our choices are self-determined. I thought that I would play a clip here from a very astute libertarian free will brother, and he delineates this out quite well. So what you've said, Eric, is there's basically two kinds of free will. There's you can do this or you cannot. If you have the ability to do it and to not do it, then that means that it's, and you'll hear him use these words as sufficient and necessary, which I'm going to throw this up here and then we can talk about what he's talking about here. So hopefully this is helpful to you. This is Eric Hernandez. He's engaged in debates with Calvinists and atheists. He usually seems to engage with more skeptics, but in this particular instance, this was on Chris Featherstone's channel, which he brings so much energy at the beginning of this debate. I was like, oh man, like we need to bring some energy like that on our podcast. Like he's like, welcome everybody. I'm so excited. It's really hooked me in there. But so here's this and we'll play it and talk about it.
Freely will something. Even if I can't feel, so that'd be important to keep in mind. Now, there are two basic positions on free will. There's libertarianism and determinism, that essentially two camps. Now, I am a libertarian with regards to free will, and to identify this, we can look at two things. The first is being the original source or first cause of one's will or actions. So we can call this being the first mover, which means you are not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. So if you choose to raise your hand and that was caused by you and not, like, say, the shock of a taser, then you were the originator and source of your will. Now, the second way you can identify libertarian free will is by having the ability to do or refrain from doing any given action or will. Let's call it X. We can call this dual ability. So if I have a choice between A or B, then according to libertarianism, I chose, let's say, A. Nothing caused me to do it. And not only did I have the ability to choose A, but I had the ability to refrain from choosing A. Now, one more distinction I want to make clear is that, at least for our purposes here, the way I define libertarian freedom is my primary focus is going to be the first one, because I think that this first criteria is both necessary and sufficient. That is to say, as long as you're the first mover, then libertarian free will is established. Whereas dual ability, while important, it would be a sufficient condition, but not necessary, because I'm perfectly fine with saying there might be some instances in which perhaps it might be the case that I cannot do otherwise, but as long as I'm the first mover, then I'm uncaused and I'm the source of my will or action. So the first one is necessary and sufficient. The second is merely sufficient, but not necessary. Now let's contrast this with determinism.
Okay. So that was his intro to libertarianism. I'm just going to click back so that we can have this in front of us here. And he's going to go on to describe determinism, but we're going to use an actual source from actual determinists to talk about that, so we can't be accused of misrepresenting. So this is what you said, Eric, about the agent causal, the first mover thing here at the top. And there are some technical sort of definitions here that he talks about: necessary and sufficient for the first one, being the first mover, and then dual ability, that it's sufficient but not necessary. So this is basically fancy philosophical jargon for you. Necessary means you must be the first mover of your actions in order for libertarian free will to be used, to be true. And sufficient means that it's enough. Like, if this is true, if you have the ability to refrain from or not refrain from any particular sin, then that means in that instance you have libertarian freedom. So it's sufficient but not necessary. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, that it would be sufficient to establish the case that libertarianism is true. But if you are the first mover, then it is necessarily the case that libertarianism is true. Is that, do you think that's right?
Yeah. So he's saying that, yeah, it's necessary. You have to have the first thing, but you don't necessarily have to have the second thing.
Because there can be times when I don't really have a choice. And I think we've talked about this kind of thing before, where you
don't
are
have contrary
limited.
Choice.
You don't have contrary choice.
Yeah.
Where you are limited because of circumstances or an addiction or something that you are limited in your choices. And I think this is libertarian free will, libertarianism recognizes limitations. It isn't saying that free will doesn't mean you can do anything. So you can defy God, or you can obligate God, or free will isn't this superpower which makes you able to do anything. We fully recognize that there are limitations. So in that same way, there could be a situation, and there's an analogy that Eric gave earlier, where I desire to do something, I will to do something, but I can't do it. So there could be some limitations there where contra causal or dual ability choice isn't the case in terms of like an alcoholic really isn't making choices. They're just sort of reacting, and rehab and counseling would get them to the place where they start making choices again. So you, in some cases, you don't need to have, you don't need to establish that there are two choices, dual ability, contra causa free will, for free will to be true. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think we'll put the link in the description so you guys can check this out in its entirety. I think it ended up being a little bit more of a discussion than it was a debate, but one thing that I appreciated that he said was what you alluded to just there, which is the differentiation between desire, will, and action. So I'm actually free to will to fly.
Right.
I just can't carry it out. So even saying you don't have the free will to fly, do you, is an equivocation on you don't have the ability to fly. But we're not talking about whether or not we have the ability to fly. We're talking about whether or not we have the ability to desire, to will something. There's desire,
Right.
and then
Right.
willing, making myself to do it, so to speak. He talks about reaching out and grabbing something, and the action itself.
Well,
So,
and if you are to go further there, if I can will, whether I can fly or not, if I can will to fly or not will to fly, then libertarianism is established.
right, exactly, yeah. So because even that is an action of willing,
Yes.
or a thing that's happening. And
Yes.
what I think is so crazy making about all of this is, Eric, is that, and I posted this on Twitter one time, and people started losing their minds. Is all I have to do is demonstrate one free will choice, and determinism is false. Because what determinism says is that everything outside of me all my decisions are caused by some antecedent factor. So if I show just one libertarian choice and or a handful of libertarian choices, and we'll look at some of those here in a moment, hopefully, and then that completely falsifies determinism. Whereas with determinism, you have to demonstrate that every single action, not just action, thoughts, words, and so on, are determined. So we can get into a little bit of that now, shall we?
Let's do it.
What is determinism? Here we go. So here is an article called "How Can God Be Sovereign and Man Still Be Free?" And I think the title of this article is so interesting. In our last episode where we reviewed R.C. Sproul's, is it Sproul or Sproul? I don't know.
I think it's Sproul.
R.C. Sproul. We reviewed his teaching on God's sovereignty and how he basically equates sovereignty to determinism. So even this question for the libertarian, how can God be sovereign and man still be free, is like a non-question.
Yeah.
It's like what? How can a king still be a king and have free subjects? What? I don't even understand why that's.
Yeah. How can a king still be king and then one of his subjects does something he doesn't want them to do?
Right.
Obviously, that happens.
Yeah. So this is John Hendricks. He's a leading, I don't know if he's a scholar per se, but he's written a number of articles on this website. I tried to find more information about him so I could introduce him, but I wasn't really able to in the limited time I had. But here's what he says. He says, responsibility and voluntary choice are not the same thing as free will. We affirm that man is indeed responsible for the choices he makes, yet we deny that the Bible teaches that man has a free will, since it is nowhere taught in the pages of Scripture. That's a really bold statement. It is nowhere taught in the pages of Scripture. We'll get to that. The Bible teaches rather that God has ordained all things that come to pass. And he gives a Scripture reference there for that. And it also teaches that man is culpable or able to be held guilty for his choices. Ezekiel 18:20, which ironically talks about not being passed on the guilt of fathers, like Adam. Anyways, he gives these different passages here, which we won't have time to get into. But he says, since the Scriptures are ultimate authority and highest presupposition, the multitude of clear scriptural declarations on this matter outweigh all unaided human logic. Okay, we find that almost always the objections to God's meticulous providence, so that's what he means by the word sovereign, remember, over all things, are moral and philosophical rather than exegetical. So he thinks that our affirmations of libertarianism are primarily moral and philosophical rather than exegetical. This means we must strive to consciously affirm what the scripture declares over all our finite understanding and sinful inner drive for independence. Way to poison the well, bro. So here's the definition. Okay.
I would like for Mr. Hendricks here to demonstrate to me how he understands any scripture without using his logic.
Yeah, and he has a sinful inner drive for independence. So
yeah,
interesting. So he's overcome his sinful inner drive for independence, I guess.
I guess that's what he's saying, right?
Yeah,
because
by the grace of God, he has graced him with the knowledge of determinism, and he's not, in bondage to his sinful desire.
Because he's embraced the right theological truth of determinism. He's overcome, the human desire for independence.
Yeah. So then he says, in order to understand this better, theologians have come up with the term compatibilism to describe the concurrence of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Listen to this, guys. Listen to this. Compatibilism is a form of determinism, and it should be noted that this position is no less deterministic than hard determinism. So since this is a little bit of an intro episode, there are two different kinds of determinism. There's compatibilism, which basically means that determinism is compatible with human responsibility and human accountability. And then there's hard determinism, which I don't know who these people are, but they believe that it's just pure determinism and we're not accountable, I guess, is what hard determinism is. Like, I feel like I've yet to actually encounter someone who's a hard determinist who doesn't still believe that we're actually accountable. But
I haven't met that person either, but I've met people who have affirmed determinism. I mean,
right.
They still think that God can do whatever he wants to do.
Mm. And so he says, it simply means that God's predetermination and meticulous providence is compatible with voluntary choice. Notice that he didn't use the words free will here. He's being careful about this. Our choices are not coerced, i.e., we do not choose against what we want or desire, yet we never make choices contrary to God's sovereign decree. What God should say has determined will always come to pass. Ephesians 1:11. So what he's saying here is that although everything is determined, we're not coerced to do things because we always do what we want to do, right? So that's the sense in which we are free, is that we do what we want to do.
Right. So the difference between when we say we believe in free will and someone who is a compatibilist, when they say they believe in free will, the difference is our definition of free will we gave at the beginning, and you can do what you want to do. So that's their definition of free. You're doing what you want to do.
Right.
So that's where the confusion comes in. They're using the same terms. They're saying, oh yeah, we make choices. Sure. We have free will. Sure. Why
many
not?
will use free will. He's not using the words free will here.
Yes.
But many will use free will.
That's right.
Which I do. I think I appreciate his consistency here with, I think it's still a little bit of sophistry of masking, using words like voluntary and stuff like that. But
what does voluntary mean on determinism? I mean,
yeah.
Who's volunteering? You're not volunteering to do any of these things. Like, that's not
right. Here we go. Let me throw this back up here. So, in light of Scripture, according to compatibilism, human choices are exercised voluntarily, but the desires and circumstances that bring about these choices occur. That's a typo, I guess. Am I reading that? Anyways, through divine determinism. For example, God is said to specifically ordain the crucifixion of his son, and yet evil men willfully and voluntarily crucify him. This is the example people use, Christians use for compatibilism. This act of free evil is not free from God's decree, but it is it is voluntary, and these men are thus responsible for the act according to these texts. Or when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt, Joseph later recounted what his brothers intended for evil, God intended for good. God determines and ordains that these events will take place, has determined and has ordained that Joseph will be sold into slavery. Yet the brothers voluntarily make the evil choice that brings it to pass. which means the sin is imputed to Joseph's brothers for the wicked act, and God remains blameless. Here's this, I found this really interesting. So in both of these cases, it should be said that God ordains sin sinlessly. Nothing occurs apart from his sovereign good pleasure. So this is similar to what R.C. Sproul said in our episode that we just released last week, also known as the episode that we just recorded earlier today. And, you know, Eric, you had a conversation with someone. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but you had a long conversation with someone where you basically got to the point where it was like, yes, God causes sin, but he causes sin. So this uses the word ordains. Yes, God causes sin, but he causes sin through secondary causes such that he is blameless. Right?
Yes.
So this was a conversation that you had without naming names and stuff like that. So you can say God is the ultimate cause of sin, or God causes sin underneath determinism, but it's not directly. It's through secondary means, through contingencies and stuff. You know, R.C. Sproul mentioned this in our episode last week. So
yeah, it's the idea is that everyone that God does, anything God does is done in a holy way, even if it seems to us to be sinful.
And obviously we're not determinists. So, you know, we may be speaking a little bit like, you know, obviously this is really ridiculous, but yeah. So let's read just a little bit more of this. We should be clear that neither compatibilism nor hard determinism affirms that any man has a free will. Those who believe man has a free will are not compatibilists, but should rather be called inconsistent. So most of the time when someone who is Reformed or Calvinist is saying, yes, we have free will, what they mean is this compatibilism, you're doing what you want to do.
Voluntary.
Here's how he expounds on this more. Our choices are our choices because they are voluntary, not coerced. We do not make choices contrary to our desires or natures, nor separately from God's meticulous providence. Furthermore, compatibilism is directly contrary to libertarian free will, so they can't be true at the same time. Therefore, voluntary choice is not the freedom to choose otherwise. So that freedom to choose otherwise is libertarianism. That is a choice without any influence, prior prejudice, inclination, or disposition. What?
Yeah,
this is a straw man. So this is not what we believe. We don't believe that free will means that we're completely and totally free from any kind of prior prejudice, influence, inclination, or disposition. We simply mean that the influences, prior prejudice, inclination, and dispositions do not cause or determine a particular choice. That's
right.
really important. Voluntary does mean, however, the ability to choose what we want or desire most according to our disposition and inclinations, which God is in control of. The former view, libertarianism, is known as contrary choice, the latter free agency. So he's saying that his version, he's calling it free agency. The fallen will is never free from the bondage of our corrupt nature and not free in any sense from God's eternal decree. We could dissect that, but let's not get into it. The reason I emphasize this is that compatibilists are often misrepresented by hard determinists at this point. Who are they? We don't know. They are somehow confused with inconsistent Calvinists. When compatibilists use such phrases as compatibilistic freedom, they are more often than not using it to mean voluntary choice, but are not referring to freedom from God's decree or absolute sovereignty, an impossible supposition.
What's interesting there is he's saying that choices cannot be free from God's decree or absolute sovereignty. I can fully affirm that. As a libertarian, any of my choices cannot be free from God's decree or absolute sovereignty. Of course, that's true. But what's interesting here is that he would have to say that us libertarians believe that God is not sovereign if we have contra-causal free will choice. If we have this free will choice, then we're somehow going against God's decree or absolute sovereignty. But I thought that was impossible. So it's really strange to paint it in that way.
Well, he thinks that libertarian freedom is logically impossible. I mean, it's what R.C. Sproul said last week, was that if this deterministic statement from the Westminster Confession of Faith is, if you disagree with this, then you're an atheist, because if God is sovereign, if God is God, then God is sovereign, and this is also true. So an impossible supposition, he's saying, if there is a God, this must be true.
Right.
I think is what he's saying, that if there is a God and he is sovereign, then there can be no libertarian freedom.
But he's arguing against people that don't exist. There isn't a libertarian out there who is saying that their free will choices can overpower God's decree, can go against God's decree, who can overcome God's sovereignty. That we just don't think that God decreed all choices. He decreed certain things, but he didn't decree all choices. And we don't think that sovereignty means he meticulously determines all choices. So he doesn't get even what the counterposition is correctly. He doesn't even.
Yeah. And there's a lot of loaded stuff in here too, right?
Yeah.
So when he says freedom from God's decree, when he says God's decree, he means God's immutable pre-creation determined decree that locks everything to work out only one way. So yes, libertarian freedom and that don't fit.
Right.
You know.
Are you seeing why you should be a little bit confused?
Yeah,
Are you starting to see the rabbit hole?
And
that
I want to
get into.
It's crazy, man. This is wait. Okay, here we go. I just want to throw this up here. Okay, here's John Calvin, the Calvinist on this issue, right? We allow that man has choice and that it is self-determined, which anyways, let's not get into that. Okay, so that if he does anything evil, it should be imputed to him and to his own voluntary choosing. We do away with coercion and force because this contradicts the nature of the will and cannot coexist with it. We deny that choice is free because through man's innate wickedness, it is of necessity driven to what is evil and cannot seek anything but evil. And from this, it is possible to deduce what a great difference there is between necessity and coercion. For we do not say that man is dragged unwillingly into sinning, but that because his will is corrupt, he is held captive under the yoke of sin, and therefore of necessity will in an evil way. For where there is bondage, there is necessity, but it makes a great difference whether the bondage is voluntary or coerced. We locate the necessity of sin precisely in corruption of the will, from which follows that it is self-determined. This is John Calvin from Bondage and Liberation of the Will. So that's one quote from John Calvin. Okay, ready? Hold on. Let me just go up here and highlight this one more time. We do away with coercion and force because this contradicts the nature of the will and cannot coexist with it. Okay? That's what he said. So this is a status or OP that I created once upon a time and put in the Facebook groups. This is pick one, only one. This is from John Calvin. The devil. So context for this, what he's saying is he's trying to comfort saints who are in affliction from evil people and wicked people who are persecuting them in circumstances in their life. So this is the context that he says this in. The devil and the whole train of the ungodly are in all directions held by the hand of God as with a bridle, so that they can neither conceive any mischief, nor plan what they have conceived, nor how much soever they may have planned, move a single finger to perpetrate, unless so far as he permits, nay, unless so far as he commands. So he says permits, and then he says no, unless he commands. It's like a rhetorical kind of flourish there. That they are not only bound by his fetters, but are even forced to do him service. John Calvin, Institutes of Christian Religion. There's the address. You can see that at the bottom. Then this one basically says, this is from the Bible. Everything in the world, cravings of sinful man, lust of eyes, and boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. So these lusts, desires do not come from the Father, but from the world. And he's saying that these evil people are forced to do him service. And nay, unless so far as he commands. So this is the crazy making stuff. That is, hopefully you can see, you be the judge, right? I mean, in theory, you could say he's dealing with different issues and he's dealing with this one, but he says, and I have this other quote here, we do away with coercion at first because this contradicts the nature of the will and cannot coexist with it. So are these wicked, evil people that he's forcing to do him service? Is that like, so what's going on there? I don't understand. Somebody explain it to me. anyways, so that's compatibilism. We've read from the original sources who I think are making their case but are contradicting themselves. And there's one more clip that we want to show you guys that illustrates how this plays out. Like how, through what mechanism is it that God accomplishes his decree through the free voluntary choices of people. So this is a debate between Stephen Boyce, who has some letters after his name, and our dear brother over at Soteriology 101, Leighton Flowers. And let's just roll the clip. You listen to it.
Has to. He sins because he wants to. Nobody sins and says.
And why does he want to?
I just didn't. They wanted to do.
And why does he want to? Why does he want to?
It's in his nature. It's a part
And why
of
is
that
his nature that way? And why is his nature that way?
Because we are sons and daughters of a fallen Adam and Eve who passed that nature on to all of us.
And why is that? Why is that passed on to us?
Well, that's what them that you eat. And then Paul elaborated on that in Romans chapter 5. It's by that one man that sin entered into the world, and death by
who
sin.
decided that eating the forbidden fruit would cause people to be in a fallen condition and therefore unable to respond to God's own appeals to be reconciled from that fall? Who made that decision?
Very clear it was from God himself. Very clear.
Okay, so God, so just to be clear, so I'm just to be clear here, Calvinists believe that God decided before the world began through his sovereign decree that all people would be born unable to reply to his own message of redemption, to be reconciled from the fall in order to glorify himself in their reprobation and their condemnation and their perishing in hell for all of eternity. Is that your position?
Well, what we just did there is we went from human responsibility to fatalism. Like, I'm not a fatalist.
No, I mean, I just repeated what you said. You said that God sovereignly decreed that because Adam and Eve fell, that all people would be born in a morally incapable condition, a spiritually incapable condition. By the way, John Piper uses the word morally incapable, and you say spiritually incapable, but ultimately it's referring to the same inability, that this wanter is broken, as R.C. Sproul says it. And so therefore he will only want to hate the things of God by birth. I mean, he doesn't have any control over the fact that he hates God from birth, just like apparently if he's reprobate, God hated him. How is that not just, I mean, I'm just restating what you said.
Because you remove that the mind, will, and emotion of that human wants to sin. It's not that.
So we're just going to pause it there because they go on to talk about this. You should go watch the full debate. We'll put the link in the description. But so what Leighton is trying to, and if you're confused, again, did you see how many questions Leighton had to ask to get past but they want to sin, right? But why do they want to sin? Because they have a nature, they have a corrupt nature, right? But who gave them that corrupt nature? Well, it's God. God why is that? Well, because Adam sinned. Okay, so God chose to do this. So this is a debate about total depravity. It's a little bit in the vein of what we're talking about here, but he's demonstrating the mechanism through which God ensures that everything that is happening is what he wants to happen, which is through having decreed that we would have these specific kinds of natures that would produce specific kinds of desires, that would produce specific kinds of choices amidst circumstances that he's also in control of.
And so we read something from Hendricks that is very clear about what they believe and is very careful in the language of saying voluntary choice and not saying free will, and very clear that it is just as deterministic as hard determinism, and is very clear about it. And you're like, oh, okay, I kind of see that. And you'll even you can even look up compatibilism in the philosophical literature. You don't even have to go to anything theological or Christian. You can just look up compatibilism in the theological literature, in the philosophical literature, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, I have to sift through some of the philosophical jargon here, but okay, they're very clear about what their position is. But then you get to sort of this end where we are, that's sort of maybe a little bit farther down the academic line of discussing these things. But when you get to the kind of end user, us who are on the other sides of cameras, on the other sides of keyboards, engaged in the soteriological controversies online, you get this sort of thing that Stephen Boyce is doing, which he's going like, no, people want to do it. And you have to get down to, you have to ask 5, 6, 7 questions. You have to peel the layers of the onion back to get to, oh yeah, no, God decides everything. And that's the actual difference. The actual difference is we are incompatibilists. I just threw another word at you.
That word triggers me, by the way, Eric.
I know. We are incompatibilists in that those two things aren't compatible. Blaming human beings for what God decided they would do is incompatible. You can't, that doesn't
Those
make,
two don't fit.
Those two don't fit.
And
it doesn't make any rational sense. And it leaves God in the position of kind of holding the moral basket. He's just, he's there making the actual moral decisions for evil. And that's not where we want him to be.
Yeah. And the, more philosophically, like we're incompatibilist. Compatible means determinism is compatible with being responsible for our choices. So those are compatible. So we would say incompatibilists.
Right.
And they think that God is sovereign means determinism. That's why the title of the article was, how can God be sovereign and man be free?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, this is the important stuff. Free will as taught in Scripture. This is on the Soteriology 101 website. This is by Brian Wagner. He's also got some letters behind his name, if that matters to you. He introduces some of the stuff here, which you can read. We don't really have time to go through all of this. He talks about the Hebrew words and stuff, and then goes through a whole bunch of scriptures, which are really cool that establishes the biblical case for this. I just wanted to kind of touch on one of these that I have found compelling that's in the New Testament, actually. So here he says, other New Testament verses to consider that speak of the issue of free will are these. And it says, 1 Corinthians 7:37, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, you might remember earlier that it was talking about our choices being necessary, but having his desire under control and has determined in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So he gives the Greek here, and it says literally not having a necessity, which would be impossible if everything was predetermined eternally and immutably, making every event a necessary result of God's decree. Notice also this verse says this man has his desire under control and has determined this in his heart. So I'm willing to, I guess, pay lip service to the fact that I have heard how people get around this, but I think you have to do too much to it. So again, here it is, being under no necessity. So how can you say determinism is true, all of our choices are necessity, and also God-breathed scripture says that being firmly established in his own heart, he has no necessity. So they would argue that this is like a cultural thing. Like it's not necessary. You don't have to do it underneath the cultural paradigm, but underneath God's eternal decree, it's still necessary.
Right. His family member isn't forcing him. Nobody's watching him 24/7. He's got his sexual desire under control. Yeah.
And the big thing here underneath this passage is having power over his own will, or the NIV says having his desire under his control. The whole question about determinism, compatibilism, and libertarian freedom for me is I'm free to do what I want to do, right? That's what they say. You're free because you do what you want. Am I free to want what I want? Do I have power over what I want to do? And this says yes, having your desire under control. How can there be in any meaningful sense any such thing as self-control, or having your this says your desire under control, having power, the more literally is power over your own will, if God has immutably decreed whatsoever you will do.
Or if compatibilism is true and then you always do your greatest desire. How can you
Right,
have your desire
right.
under control if you always do your greatest desire? Is it just your greatest desire to have your desire under control? Like, a gymnastics you have to do to get there, right?
Yeah, yeah. And C.S. Lewis writes about this in his Mere Christianity, and I actually wanted to talk about this in this episode, but I don't have the book here, and we've kind of run out of time. Maybe we'll talk about it in depth one day. But he talks about instincts that we have. So we have an instinct that says, you see somebody drowning, the herd mentality is, I should help him. I should help him. And then, but there's self-preservation instinct that says, no, I want to save myself. And actually, the save myself instinct desire is the strongest desire, but there's a moral law in the back of your brain telling you you should side with the weaker desire. And he's using this argument to prove existence of God and to differentiate instincts. We just have instincts, because he's saying instincts isn't enough,
animals,
because actually your instinct, the moral law is often telling you that you should ramp up that desire to go help him, or just choose to do it because it's the right thing to do. And so I thought that was a really compelling argument. It's in his book Mere Christianity, in the chapter on some objections, I think it is. So if you have that book, check it out. And he's differentiating us from animals, right? and I think that ultimately what compatibilism does is it says, and this is so debilitating, Eric. Like, if you're talking about sin and you're talking about struggling with sin, and you think I can only do what my strongest desire is to do, and you just feel like you really want to sin, and you're believing this in your brain, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to sin, right? You're going to say, well, this is my highest desire. I just don't understand how it doesn't collapse into that. And I know that this is an anecdotal argument, but that's kind of how I felt a lot. I felt like, well, I'm just a sinner, and sinners want to do these things. And I have this flesh that's just with me, not thinking about taking personal responsibility for my own actions. And like, actually, no, I can do differently. I can actually respond and refrain from doing this, or run the other way, or whatever else. So this is our take on all of this. If you're super extra confused and this hasn't helped you at all, then you're probably on the right track. So
right, exactly.
So if you have any questions for us, comment below, get us on the socials. We want us all to kind of be on the same page, I guess. So when we use words like libertarianism and determinism, we say all these determinists, that, I can see how people would be like, what is he talking about? There's like determinists out there. So this is that. What is this? The confused take on determinism and libertarianism. So thanks for tuning in. Eric, you got anything to add?
If you're still confused, then you're in the right place, and good, because I was confused for a long time, and so you have to suffer like I did. But no, keep asking questions and keep looking into this. We can drill down into these things and speak clearly and explain our positions clearly. And I think we all should be held to a standard where we are explaining our positions clearly, and we can drill down into this stuff and understand it. And people like Eric Hernandez and Hendricks and Dr. Flowers help us do that. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If not, it's Drew's fault. And we'll see you next time on the Provisionist Perspective.
We'll see you later.